Okay, we now have a quorum and we'll begin the closing the Justice Gap SAGE Subcommittee meeting. This meeting is being recorded with permission of the co-chairs. I will start with the roll call. Mary Baldwin.
Here.
John Lund.
Here.
Andrew Arruda. Judge Wendy Chang. Dan Grunfeld.
Here.
Eric Helland.
Here.
Wendy Mussel. Jim Sandman.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mimi. Hi, everybody. The first item on our agenda as we work through our co-chair's report is public comment.
Okay, if there's anyone who'd like to give public comment, please use the raise hand function. And it looks like no one's indicated they'd like to give public comment.
Okay, well, thanks, Mimi. Next, announcements. At the co-chairs, we have a couple of specific announcements about the agenda and some decisions we made about reordering the agenda, but we can deal with that when we get down to the agenda. So I don't think, John, we don't have any announcements. So I guess does anybody else, or do we next turn to staff report?
No staff report today. Thank you.
Ooh, this is like the most efficient meeting ever. Then the next item is approval of the open session action summary from our October 6th, 2021 meeting. Hopefully you all had a chance to look at that. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Jim.
Second.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay. Any discussion? Okay, Mimi?
All right, Mary Baldwin,
Approve.
John Lund,
Approve.
Andrew Arruda, Judge Wendy Chang, Dan Grunfeld, Eric Helland,
Approved.
Wendy Mussel, Jim Sandman.
Approved.
Thank you.
I think
Okay.
Dan was trying to unmute.
Okay,
Mimi.
Dan,
I apologize.
that's okay. Do you approve?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Great. All right, well, that was a hasty departure or a hasty advance to our discussion section. So thanks, everybody. So the slight adjustment to the agenda that John and I would like to make is what we've currently got listed as item 2A, which is the discussion and possible action on a recommendation for risk-based approach to regulation. If you recall, at our working group meeting, we of the 5 numbered items on our memo, which we've kind of discussed quite a bit. We did not get kind of tabled items 3, 4, and 5. So those remain on something that we need to, if this committee wishes to further discuss and or further refine and then send back to the working group. We decided we're going to move that because we've discussed it a number of times, and we don't think there's particularly anything new right now on those or urgent. So we're going to move that item to last and start with item 2B. Obviously, if we get to it today, we certainly will, but just wanted to explain that. And then also, if you see on our agenda, item 2D was discussion and possible action on exiting the sandbox and the recommended term for the sandbox. And in a leadership meeting, we graciously gave up that topic to scope. So it has not disappeared as an item that we as a working group will have to deal with, but we as SAGE no longer have that on our plate. We have enough. So we handed it off to scope, and they graciously or not so graciously accepted it, whatever. We don't care. It's off our list. So so today we really have the sort of items. We'll start with item 2B, then 2C, go back to 2A if necessary, and then discussion of next steps and possible new assignments last. So with that, turn it over to John.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see everybody. Hope you're all doing well. Cannot believe it's November. Our time for finishing this project fast approaches, as Randy would be quick to remind us. I'm going to introduce this concept, this discussion about the proactive regulation tools, which, as you will recall, we provided this list and had some discussion about it with the entire working group at the last working group session. I think there were a couple of comments made, and before I go any further, I'd like to give a shout out to Bridget for doing a lot of work to put these things, in order for us to consider again today. Thank you for that, Bridget. If you had help from others, I don't know about it, but if you did, we appreciate their help as well.
Of course, staff is always really supportive of all of this. So thank you to everybody that helped.
So conceptually, I guess where we are in our view with the rules is that, it's not an overly controversial question that we should put a good list of rules out there for, application. And I think we should talk through those specifics, but if you'll look at the memo, the proposed recommendation, this is the 2B proactive monitoring memo. The proposed recommendation, conceptually is really recommending that the regulator implement any or all of these tools with some articulation of the point of it. And the point of it, as it's worded here, is to provide robust regulatory oversight of the sandbox providers. So it may be that the wording of that introduction and just what it is that we're suggesting the regulator be expected to do with this list of tools is as important as the list. Past that, I think we added risk assessment here as a tool because obviously that has something to do with it. How somebody is considered going into the sandbox and what they're determined to be the level of risk is a critical tool in terms of then how they're handled going forward. And I don't know, Bridget, maybe you should highlight any differences in this list from the list that we had going into the working group session. I don't know that there's anything too significant.
Sure, it's really not that significant. One thing I did do was, if you remember, we had listed a compliance attorney as one of the tools. And after Toby pointed out, that's something that the whole working group is voting on and considering separately. So I took that off this list just to avoid confusion about it, even though some kind of, it is a tool for quality assurance, but I think it's going to be more on the maybe within the scope committee's purview and the full working group as far as like a entry qualification, maybe perhaps. So I just took that off of this list. The other thing I added, a couple other things I added had to do with the disclosure requirements. If you scroll down to number 5, maybe, we just threw in here that something to put a pin in or as a reminder that the paraprofessional working group they put together a disclosure requirement as one of their recommendations to let people know that if you qualify, you may qualify for free legal services. And so some kind of disclosure, in addition to the fact that, the specific disclosures like this is not a law firm or we are not owned by lawyers, or those types of specific disclosures with respect to whatever service models might be operating in the sandbox, that one thing that the group might want to think about is an additional disclosure that there are, this is not meant to take the place of free legal aid and you might apply for free legal aid. That is currently out for public comment right now. And so it might make more sense to wait till it comes back from public comment, see if the Board of Trustees have things to add before we would maybe borrow that disclosure, but just something to flag. And the last thing I added that's different from what we had in the meeting was this number 11, the customer satisfaction surveys. That was something that came up. I think it was maybe Justice Tuker's idea or comment during our last working group meeting, just as another way to gather information about, how consumers are doing with whatever products are being delivered in the sandbox. So those are really the only things that I changed. We haven't really had a lot of time to go through them. And so I didn't know if people, my thought was putting them down. I know you've had a chance to look at them a couple different times. But if there's anything that you had questions about or anything you'd like to add, you think that should be added to this list, I thought this would be a good time to do it.
Thanks, Bridget. Jim, I see you got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Is this list of recommended options intended to be exclusive? The introductory language says any or all, but doesn't seem to acknowledge the possibility that the regulator might come up with additional measures.
You know, so I put a sentence at the end, which it was mostly because of punctuation. I couldn't figure out what to do with the colon. So we can move it up.
Got it. Okay.
But yeah, so
That responds to my question.
okay.
Thank you.
But Jim, I think your question raises a bit broader element here. But, you know, if you imagine this all being built into the ultimate report of the working group as a recommendation around this, and you are the person charged with implementing a sandbox somewhere down the road, how would you take this, and what would you consider to be the, you know, the expectation or the flexibility that you have? And I think that goes to your question. It also goes to this introductory language. What is the purpose of these tools from the standpoint of the regulator? And I do want to make sure we've got that worded correctly in a way that everyone feels is as well as good as we can do it.
Yeah, I do think that's a good point. We should put some thought into it, because as we discussed, John and Mary and I, when we were putting the agenda together, this really is at the heart of the regulation, right? This is at the heart of the consumer protection aspect of what we're proposing. And so it's important for the public to know, and for people to know as we're putting this proposal together, that all these tools are available, and this is what we're planning, you know, how the proactive regulation model will really work. So the more that we can flesh that out, or if it looks incomplete to you, even if just the description looks incomplete, we can definitely add to it.
Eric.
Just a sort of a quick question on this. Are we thinking of this? So it seems to me there's two pieces. One is the evaluation, because ultimately, since this is a sandbox, the thinking is that this will lead to some restructuring of the rules down the road, right? And I could think of evaluation tools that are not necessarily about consumer protection or risk abatement or something like that. And then I could think of things that were, you know, specifically for protecting customers. And we put those two together in this, which I think is fine. There may be a separate place where we want to talk about that, but it may be worth calling out that the regulator may have things it wants entities to do that don't have to do with consumer protection, but have to do with information about the functioning of the sandbox. I haven't really thought that through, but it just occurred to me reading this that, you know, the sandbox is also providing, you know, sort of regular updates to, you know, the judiciary and the legislature on how this is functioning, you know, and I guess my thinking was always that at various points, whoever's responsible for that may want to say, okay, you know what, anybody requesting, you know, a different ownership structure, we don't need to send that through the sandbox anymore. We can end that part of this, as kind of Arizona has done. John, maybe that's a distinction without a difference in the point of view of Utah. Those two just, the only thing we're worried about is consumer protection, but I just wanted to like flag that for 1 second.
Well, Eric, are there particular ones on the list that you see as sort of beyond that function of consumer protection?
It was kind of the other way. It was, you know, were there things that, again, I haven't thought this through completely, but I guess I was thinking, you know, when we had people talking about, you know, the adequacy of representation or something like that, right? It might be that it's not doing harm, but do we want to know how it's doing relative to people who sort of go to legal aid or something? I haven't really thought this through. It just dawns on me that we kind of have two functions here. One is information generation and one is consumer protection.
Well, I would just offer that we've tried to be sure the regulatory job of the sandbox regulator is kept pretty clear on assessing, monitoring, and hopefully minimizing harm to consumers from and learning about it, as opposed to sort of reporting, for example, on how much was the access to justice gap closed, or what portion of the services were provided to people from disadvantaged communities. Not because those things aren't important, but because the question is sort of how clear is the mission that this is a regulatory mission, as opposed to some broader, I mean, I just framed that. I wanted to frame that for you because maybe
I think that answers my question. I mean, you know, because you've kind of set up the one I couldn't think of off the top of my head, but which is maybe, everyone is receiving a good service, but it's not particularly helping, sort of those with the largest justice gap, right? And I think what you're saying, it makes sense to me, is, that could be something for study, but it wouldn't necessarily be part of the regulatory function of the sandbox regulator. So it wouldn't be in here.
Right.
It seems good to
Very
me.
I don't know why I muted myself before. On that subject, I would point out that number 9 on our list does address reporting between the regulator and the court and the legislature, which does encompass some of this kind of information gathering function that Eric just discussed, and would, depending on what data was elicited, which of course this does not define exactly what information needs to be obtained, but that reporting item would, encompass, possibly number of consumers, complaints, demographics, practice areas, maybe even other information that is gleaned from the clients.
And,
Other
also,
thoughts? Oh,
oh,
go ahead,
I was
Bridget.
just going to say, maybe something that you were thinking of, Eric, was the badge requirement or the disclosure requirement are kind of separate from like the evaluation and reporting piece of it. So would that make sense to pull out? I'm just looking at, because I see what you mean. Like some of these things are more like evaluation and some of them are more regulation and some of them are like things that you have to agree to before you come in.
Right.
So we could organize them a little bit differently.
Jim?
Eric's comment reminded me of a very different, but I think relevant point. He mentioned something about the functioning of the sandbox, and it made me think about the functioning of the regulatory process as it affects the sandbox. And I think we should think about balancing the burdens of reporting against the benefits of reporting. The regulator might go hog wild with all kinds of information that they'd like to get, which would be interesting and might satisfy curiosity and generate data that researchers would like. And it will kill the sandbox because the participants will say we're spending more time reporting what we're doing than doing what we're doing.
Interesting.
So I've seen this in the context of the Legal Services Corporation and its relationships with its grantees, who are required to report a lot about what they do. And I think we should think about that. I at least flag the issue somehow, that I think it should be a function of the regulator to assess periodically the extent to the balance between the value of the information they're requesting and the benefit to consumers and the overall practical functioning of the sandbox.
Eric, did you have something responsive to that?
Yeah, I guess maybe just in the following, and I've literally thought this through no longer than like the seconds it took me to get this unmuted, but I wonder if what we're really saying is that the regulator's primary function is consumer protection, that it is not, that to the extent that information is generated out of this, that's not the function of the regulator, which is kind of the extreme end of Jim's point. I hadn't really been thinking about this, but Jim's 100% right. If this becomes a test venue for changing the legal services market, we may discourage entry that we want. And so, my thinking of this as an experiment does run into the problem of regulatory compliance. Whereas in the case of consumer protection, saying, do what's necessary, you think, to protect consumers, relax that as you go along, I would think would be sort of more justified, right, to sort of Jim's point.
Well, Mimi, if you could scroll up to the top wording, proposed recommendation, just at the very top. I think that language, following practical tools for what purpose? This currently reads to provide robust regulatory oversight. I think there was other iterations of this that said to ensure protection of consumers, which might lean, I'm not sure it can be insured. it might be to, protect consumers. But to Jim's point, it may be that the purpose is to, provide consumer protection without, in due balance with the innovation, goal or whatever. I mean, there's a way to wordsmith that, which might get us closer to what, we're really kind of thinking the regulator should do with these tools. Thoughts about that? Justice Zucker, welcome.
Thank you. Nothing I wanted to share on that subject.
Oh, okay. Randy.
So maybe something that might be worked into the overarching principle is the concept of proportionality and prioritization, because I think it's mentioned in the memo, but when people start reviewing this as a potential laundry list of tools that can be deployed depending on the risk, I think the idea that it would be proportionate to what the risk assessment is, and that even though there might be tools that seem like a great idea, like auditing or secret shoppers, that the burden on the regulator as well as on the participants for the use of those tools ought to be considered as a prioritization factor. And so, secret shoppers might be reserved for the situations where the only way we find out what's happening is by using that tool. So I think working that into the principle might be helpful so that people understand the any or all aspect of what's being listed below.
That's a good suggestion. What do you think about this? Bridget sort of started this down this road by having a tag at the end after the list about it not intending to be exhaustive. What we could do is, I see one or two approaches. One is to just on the very beginning recommend that the regulator implement any or all of the following proactive tools, without any articulation of, of what the purpose is, but then at the bottom, express something along the lines of what Randy's saying. The regulator should use these tools, obviously, to enhance consumer protection to the extent possible, but also to be mindful of the problem of undue regulatory burden on innovation, or however you say that. We could put that language kind of at the end, and I guess conceptually we could load this whole concept up before the list. But any thoughts in regard to that approach? Bridget, you're the author here.
I think that makes sense. This just my 2 cents, and I don't want this to change what the group says, but I really do think the consumer protection part of this needs to be emphasized. Even though I know what you're saying, I also am concerned that it's going to come out sounding like we might value innovation over consumer protection, which I don't think is the case. So I would be careful with that. And the other thing I would say is this does kind of flow into the risk assessment. And so perhaps we could have some kind of language. I like your approach here about kind of clarifying down here at the bottom, but something about proportionality, or, these would be used in proportion to the level of assigned risk or something like that.
Yeah,
I also understand Jim's point. I think we have to be mindful of that, not overburdening the applicants, and making sure that the information that we gather is intentional and can be used, and really is going to be used to protect the public and not just get every amount of information we can think of.
So I think the idea of not burying the lead makes a lot of sense here, and to have the intro express the goal of protecting consumers maybe is the best place to keep that, and maybe do that a bit more directly than the somewhat obtuse, robust regulatory oversight. It's the pull it to use these tools to, I don't know if it's to ensure consumer protection, or it's to, ensure is a pretty strong word. We don't want to make a guarantee there, but is there a way that we could frame that at the outset with the lead being the purpose here is primarily consumer protection, then we can do the qualifiers down below, along the lines of what Jim's talking about. Eric, I see your hand up.
I was just going to put a plug in for something, Bridget, you just said a minute ago, which was proportionality, right? Because in some sense, right, kind of the way I interpreted that was that, if this is potentially very harmful to customer, there's a big risk, and I know we're just kicking it over to the risk assessment part, then you may want to do more costly and expensive tools if the risk is fairly mild by that assessment. And so that gets us around the sort of minimizing regulatory burden or something. Maybe we don't want to minimize the regulatory burden if you're doing something that the sandbox perceives of as particularly risky. So I'll put my plug in for your language of proportionality and tying the degree of of cost to the risk assessment.
I think if we were to pull language that's focused on consumers from our other sort of principles, the risk assessment is about these four things that we identified as potential harms to consumers. So we could, I don't think we need to list them all, but we could say that the regulator is supposed to use these proactive tools to minimize the risk of harm to consumers, so then that's kind of tied. And my thought would be to put that up at the intro, to Bridget's point, above the list. And then, these other qualifiers, proportionality and the like, can be addressed below. What do you all think about that?
Like it.
Also, I think Randy was the one that said proportionality to make sure he gets the right credit.
All right, Randy, good proportionality.
Well, let's drop down to that lower language and see if we've got every concept in there that we'd like to have. And then I think the last thing on this might be to go through the list and see if there's any specific concerns or questions about any of the listed 11 items. But go ahead, Mary. I see your hand up.
No, just a slight wordsmithing. I would say regulators should use these tools to enhance public protection. And I don't know if we say, and it's this passive voice is obviously grammatically incorrect, and should use them in proportion to the level of assigned risk or something. Obviously, the key concept there is proportion.
And I think I've been saying the regulator too, for what it's worth, instead of regulators. Thanks.
Great.
I think we could tighten up that possibly without just taking out the second should, or do you think that helps to have two shoulds?
I don't think we need two shoulds.
Okay.
I like that.
Is there another element of this from the discussion? Is there another item we need to I think Jim did make the point that we want to be sure this isn't stifling innovation, and maybe that's incorporated in the concept of using them in proportion to the assigned risk. But does anybody feel we should make a more explicit statement about the regulator being mindful of not deterring innovation? What do you think about that, Jim? It was your thought.
Well, I'm taken with Bridget's point. We want to protect the public. We don't want to trade off protection of the public for encouraging innovations. So I'm comfortable with
I mean, maybe it's less about that we're worried about innovation and more that we're worried about deterring people from entering the sandbox to begin with, or from participation, right? Because that will just defeat the purpose, which I think is your point, right?
Yes, it is. Either not entering or shutting down once they've entered because it's just too hard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I mean, I guess there isn't anything here. It's we're balancing the tools against the assigned risk, but we're not balancing the burden on the Sandbox participant against the goal of avoiding risk to consumers.
Mm.
Have you got some language along that line, Jim, that you think could get to the point?
I'm thinking out loud. What if we added the regulator should also balance
A way to say that might be, encouraging to the folks that want to see less regulation in the world to be said, to say something about how the regulator should also be mindful of the negative impact of undue regulatory requirements on innovation in the marketplace or something.
John, maybe we could go with the chilling effect in some ways. I don't know if it's just another word, but I don't know. Chilling innovation is generally what people have tied to the word regulation often.
John, can I play against type just for 1 second and say, are we sure we want this language in here? And here's my thinking, right? It is possible that someone comes up with an innovation that seems particularly likely to produce sort of ill results, right? And maybe we don't want that if the regulator thinks this is what's necessary to ensure, to make sure that things are, the public is protected, the fact that we deterred that entry, maybe we don't want to stop. And I'm a little uneasy with that statement because I understand, Jim's point is absolutely right. Granting agencies regularly have requirements that they put on grants that make it too burdensome. But I do wonder if it's not captured in the proportionality already to say, if this is particularly risky, you will be subjected to sort of a more onerous data collection exercise that may be more costly. And that's what you expect if you're doing something that the regulator perceives of as having high risk. And maybe you could come back with a proposal that is less risky to customers.
What are your thoughts, Dan?
Yeah, let me play two type but echo the same point, which is the language as now, the new language is drafted, connotes some level of equality between protecting the consumers and new innovation. Let me propose that between those two, protecting the consumers is more important. I think all of us would say that at the end of the day, if we have a little less innovation, but we have more consumer protection from that innovation that does get through, ultimately in the context of California, how big we are, and the political realities of what we do, that would be the better approach. And I also agree that the notion of balance of risk and oversight is already properly articulated in some of the other points we've discussed and already in the document. So I would delete that language.
And would you delete the entirety of what's been added here or only the sentence we were just working on?
I was going to just delete the last sentence.
What Mimi has highlighted now.
This is not seemly, but let me look at it. Yes, the last sentence.
Right.
I'm okay with that. I think the concept of proportionality as reflected here is sufficient to address my point.
Okay. Andrew, you were weighing in favor of something. What do you think?
I think that, I think Daniel's point and Eric's point are important and well noted. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Any other thoughts about wording as to the intro or the conclusory paragraph? If not, I'd just like to find out if there's any specific thoughts regarding items 1 through 11 in the list. Mary, you good with this? Let's see. Dan, you still got your hand up, but I don't know if that's a vestige, and I see Randy's hand up.
It's a
Randy,
vested
go ahead.
already.
One other thought that I had is the reference to assigned risk. And I think, we want to be able to sell this to the full working group. And I know there's an assigned risk assessment protocol at the outset, but I think this could be made more acceptable if it's also acknowledged that the performance of the approved participant in the course of their sandbox life is also a consideration in the selection and use of these tools. And so there might be an assigned risk at the start, and it warrants certain tools. But then a year in, we found that this particular provider has received a certain trend of complaints from their users. And I think that might change the risk assessment, or it just might mean that other tools might be used that might be different from what was assessed at the beginning. And maybe this is something more for the report that explains risk assessment and the deployment of proactive tools. But I think it's the phrase assigned risk that I think might be creating an overreading of the idea that there's a static decision made at the outset.
Right.
You're this risk, only these tools, when I think it's more, the whole point of risk-based regulation is to have ongoing monitoring, and that ongoing monitoring evolves the risk assessment and could change the tools that are deployed. Again, probably more something for the report than the principle.
Well, I think it's a fair observation. I wonder if we just take out the word assigned. Does that change the communication if that's not there? What do you think,
What
Eric?
about adding assessed risk? Assigned risk and or assigned and or assessed risk or something.
That was literally going to be my suggestion.
Okay, sure. Great minds, they say.
That's what they say.
Okay, now any thoughts on items 1 through 11? Is there something, let's at least scroll through those, Mimi, and see if there's anything that comes to mind as you look at those. I think there's a significant amount of detail here, considering that, a regulator is still going to have to kind of write up their rules of the road in accordance with these guidelines at some point.
Well, I guess item number 1 on the list, reflecting the point we just made, the assigned risk level will determine the level at which the other regulatory tools below will be utilized. We might want to say something like, as modified by ongoing risk assessment or something.
Do you want me to put that language in?
After
or
the
we-
second bullet, you mean? that's the
Yeah,
word.
mhm.
Yeah.
Sorry, one more time.
Yeah, so for that second bullet under number 1, it says, at which the other regulatory tools below will be utilized. I would add, comma, as, or subject to modification based on risk assessment. Or ongoing risk assessment. I don't know what's the best language.
That's what I was going to suggest, ongoing. Yeah.
Oh, look at us, like all this, like,
Great mind.
Anyone have concerns with that suggestion from Mary? Okay. Well, let's keep moving down, see if there's anything else that people want to comment on. Provider reporting.
yes, John, on that one, we've listed here some types of data that the regulator might collect. And we've had some discussion, data has come up a couple of times, including over at Scope with regard to that application and all of that. Is it, to what extent is it useful and or appropriate for us as the working group to come up with a, fairly specific list of possible monitoring, possibly types of data that might be used to accomplish this risk assessment? I mean, at some point, are we going to revisit this sort of paragraph here in number 2 at the first bullet point and provide more direction? Or is this kind of the level of information that we're going to leave it at? Because we may want to indicate, if we're going to come up with more specific information later, I think we might want to sort of indicate that. If we want to leave it up to the regulator, we need to think about whether this is enough.
Well, that's a good question. I suppose the question I am asking myself in response to that is, what are we leaving for? Like, is this CTJG report that gets turned in, is it going to be the operating manual for a sandbox? Or is there some next step thing that's going to happen, once the sandbox is, if assuming it's approved, once it's set up, to sort of develop these things to an operational level? And I see Leah's hand up, so I'll leave it at that and ask Leah to respond.
Yeah, I would say it's my hope that it is sort of a detailed operational set of recommendations, because recall, this is the second task force or working group to consider this topic, and it will be, I think, going on 4 years by the time you all issue your final recommendations. And so I think that the preference would be that there is a fairly specific set of recommendations. And with respect to this issue, I think it's particularly important because it will, I hope, address some of the concerns that are out there. If folks do see what that required reporting will be, and therefore what kinds of evaluation and assessment can be done, taking it, from the amorphous and the ambiguous to pretty specific will be helpful.
Yeah. Well, what I can offer there is we have a 27 or 35 column spreadsheet, that spells out the data points that particular providers are needing to fill in. And our data team, I don't claim credit for this, but James Teufel really even built drop-down menus so that when people are filling in those data fields, you're getting a consistent sort of response in each of those fields, so that you have some consistency in the data that's being generated. So there's the ability to get extremely granular. I think, to me, that you have to weigh that against the efficiency of processing that type of information in the setting that we're in, in the committee setting. And I don't know, I'm open to thoughts about how we can do that. Bridget?
I was just going to say, I agree with Leah. I think it's important to have, some pretty detailed information. And one thing that is helpful to me, I was just seeing if I could pull it up to share with you, or I can do it later, but in the Utah Innovation Manual, at least as to, there are charts that say, if you remember, we've looked at this, I think, at our last meeting, but if you are assessed at a low risk, you have to provide this information. And it's like in a chart. It's not as detailed as what you're explaining, John, as far as like every single field, but it gives you a sense of, how many consumer complaints you've received, or whatever. I don't remember how many people you've served, that kind of information, at least at that kind of high level, could be a starting point to see what you do require. And then the frequency of reporting too increases with the level of risk. And that's all set forth in a matrix. So let me see if I can find it while you're talking. I can share my screen just to give everybody a sense of what I'm talking about.
Well, while you do that, I can give you a sense of the real granular level if you want to see the spreadsheet that we're using, but I'll just describe it. I mean, it's a data report template. legal category. There's accident and injury, marriage and family, all of those various types of category of legal problem, the start date, the time between, whether there's been any complaints, the service status, is the case open, is it closed, the end date, the method of delivery of the service, the method of delivery if there was a software provider, the amount paid, the customer's geographic location, which is by city and town. So that's for low risk folks. And then there's a more fulsome report for spreadsheet for the higher risk folks. I guess
John,
that's kind of what I'm asking.
Can I just ask one question about that? That's interesting. Is that something that the participant has to fill out for every single client served?
Right.
Mm.
And all anonymized, by the way. And if that's an important thing to make clear here, is that the data being collected by the office is anonymous as to who the recipient of the service was. So it's just they assign a client number to the particular service given.
I found what I was looking for. Mimi, is it okay if I share my screen? Is that going to mess you up? Okay.
You're good.
Okay. Do you see this?
Yes.
Okay. So this just gives you a little example anyway of, low risk. Here's the kind of information you have to get: quarterly reporting on the number of people served. And then, these are the types of things that are low to moderate risk. And you can see it's monthly instead of quarterly. And then depending on these types of services, it gets a little bit more detailed. Just to give, so I mean, to Mary's point, I think this is something that we should make sure is on our agenda, maybe for a future meeting, to just really hash out like what types of information, at least the types of information, and maybe we could have an appendix, John, that would have a more detailed example of what types of data we could pull. And clarifying too that it's not consumer data necessarily as far as like privacy goes, but it's really more about the outcomes. So here's the high risk.
So Mary, are you thinking that this gets built into, this is an expanded treatment of this particular tool, or are you thinking that we need to do that for numerous of these tools? For example, recommend a particular disclosure if they're using non-lawyer providers and come up with that language? I mean,
I think, yeah, this is all very helpful. I think that, and recognizing Leah's point, I think that we should endeavor to be as specific as we can be. And I don't think that has to happen right now. But I think we should understand that this is something that we will try to do. And I don't have a strong feeling right now about sort of how detailed we should be and how, where we can get with this. But I think providing the most detail we can will be helpful. I think for our present purposes in our memo here, and remember, what our goal is to present this back at the full working group and hopefully move this along. I think I would add some language on number 2 here, saying that.
Stop my share so you can put it back up, Mimi.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Back to the memo. I didn't mean to move us off Bridget's.
No, that's okay.
Quickly. But add something like, here we're just saying oh, this data may include, which is all fine, but I think we might want to say that the specific, more specific data reporting requirements will be discussed at a future meeting. Maybe that's too wooden, but just to anticipate the concerns that someone might have about, this isn't specific enough, what's going to happen. And if we do think that we will be addressing it as a committee or as a working group, I'd rather say that now. again, maybe someone can do a better job at wordsmithing that point, but
I think your point may apply also to the auditing. I mean, there's more detail to provide, in terms of recommending how audits would happen, and also around the badges and the disclosures.
sure,
So-
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that I'm on data in particular. The reason I thought it might be important there is because we've already had a lot of attention paid to, data reporting, the use of data. That was my concern there. But yes, I certainly take your point.
Okay. Well, I'm a little puzzled how to approach this at this point. Do we want to consider a motion to recommend as to whether our committee would recommend this resolution to the working group with the edits that we've indicated? I see Mary nodding. I see a thumbs up from Eric. Before we kind of put a motion on the table, is there any other content that somebody sees we would want to add in?
John, to your point, do you want to, do we want to explicitly spell out that in these areas of badges and auditing and so on, that we envision, take that sentence that's been added to 2 and maybe put it above put it on the general, because Mary's point is absolutely right. I mean, I would think there would be a pretty detailed appendix outlining kind of how we sort of envision this happening if we're supposed to be the guidebook. And so maybe we want to just make that a general statement to say we envision, the working group envisions a detailed data appendix fleshing out each one of these at some future date.
I see a lot of head nods. Mary, how would we go at that here? And also meet your concern about acknowledging that specifically as to data reporting. I like the concept of there's going to be an appendix.
Maybe, well, either at the top or at the bottom, and maybe at the bottom is a neater way to go. Things sometimes get overlooked at the bottom, but I don't like passive voice, but what about it is expected that the working group will, take up more specific, details of each of these tools at a later date or something. That might be too.
Mary,
I mean,
We
I
want
wonder
to
if we
mention the
want
appendix.
we also want to say, working group, we contemplate the working group supplying an appendix with detailed, protocols for X, Y, and Z tools for the benefit of the Sandbox operation or whatever.
I don't mean to throw a wrench in things, but I'm wondering about just the structure. Do you feel the need to bring this forward now without that detail, as opposed to waiting to bring it forward when you have delineated the reporting elements, at least?
What's the downside to bringing it now?
Because it seems like when I'm hearing at these meetings, like we get stuck in a lot of back and forth about discomfort with approving things in concept without the specifics. And I think with the specifics, it will be easier to answer the concerns about like under regulation, risk to the consumer. So I think it would be helpful to bring it forward as a comprehensive proposal, just to avoid some of what I'm seeing at the meetings. But again, I'm kind of dropping in and out of this, so I don't want to be disruptive. Just something for you guys to consider.
Justice Tucker.
My recollection, and you can correct me if I've confused things, is that we did already have a preliminary discussion about these tools at a recent meeting. So that would tend to, I think, argue in favor of Leah's approach to finishing the project on the theory we already have some initial reaction from folks, and then carrying it forward. It doesn't mean that you have to make it your next agenda item to finish the project. It just means that maybe you don't report it out for further discussion until you're finished with whatever level of detail you think is required. And on the subject of how much detail is required, while I certainly agree that on some topics more detail would be helpful, I think we also can remember we're working as architects of a system to design the basic structure of the house. We don't need to do builder's drawings at this point. At some level, builder's drawings have to be left to the Sandbox regulator once the Sandbox regulator has been empowered to go forward with the project. So that's a way of saying, I think it makes some good sense to hold on to this project and provide a next level of detail that we think is sufficient without trying to be absolutely exhaustive and without taking it back to the committee where we are now, which is not all that different from where we were when we last shared it with them.
Justice Zucker, your observation about the level of architecture that we're working on here is interesting. I mean, I guess what I imagine if we're going to go very granular here as to the specifics of the data and include that in an appendix or otherwise, and include it as what we recommend, that's kind of starting to specify the details of the house. If we include that appendix as, I don't know if the right word is illustrative or, examples of the type of things that could be utilized, does that help or hurt the goal of kind of getting the more detail out there? So we're having people get comfortable with it, but not getting into, frankly, arguments about how a disclosure should be worded, which I can see us spending a lot of time just wordsmithing the language of a disclosure, so I guess I'm just searching for some way to do what we need to do here, and do it right, but not get mired in things that really are past what we need to be doing.
And I can't purport to draw the line with any specificity. I just wanted to flag the issue.
Yeah. Eric?
So this is really over to Bridget and John, but it seems like between the 1,000-line spreadsheet and the, what Bridget was showing us, that appendix could have kind of those kind of examples that I think would clarify for people kind of exactly what we're talking about without the level of detail. Now that may get us into, the mire you're describing, John, but it's just struck me what Bridget put up as an appendix that says, for each one of these, and particularly since we can rely on kind of Utah's, modify those. I wonder if that's what we sort of need here, is something that is kind of the, at the various risk levels, this is sort of what we're thinking, wouldn't necessarily bind the regulator, but would give people a sense of kind of what the level of information collected was. I'm terrified of your spreadsheet.
Leah.
Yeah, I'm speaking from recent experience with the paraprofessional program working group recommendations, and then just some of our conversations with stakeholders. I do think that this group should have recommendations that are actual recommendations, not illustrative examples. And they could be framed as, at a minimum, I think that is an acceptable approach to still giving the regulator flexibility, but the amount of flexibility that the regulator is going to have is the subject of quite a bit of consternation on the part of some. So you don't want to just create something that there's a sense that the regulator could undo all of it, or does it need to adhere to the recommendations? So I know in terms of the paraprofessional program, with respect to this reporting issue, there are, that's the way that it's been posed. These are the minimum requirements the regulator can then augment, right? So there is flexibility, but there's some comfort that we know that these are the things that will be collected. So I would say that that is probably the right direction to go in, because if this group doesn't do it, then the options are another working group to do all that hard work to get into the weeds, or a regulator. And I don't think politically that will be viable, you know, to give a regulator that much discretion.
Bridget.
Well, this is just a suggestion, but would maybe some members of the working group volunteer to work on particular, you know, to help develop appendices for some of these more specific ones? Maybe we can identify that, and then, you know, you can work with us, with staff, on putting it together, and we can have that for the next working group.
Sure, if we go that way, I can help you with that, and I'm sure there's others that will volunteer. Randy?
My comment was going to the concept of illustrative or actually minimal recommendation, and I like Leah's comment about it should be minimum. The only consequence I think that has is that I think the timing of when this comes before the full working group gets pushed back a little bit. And I say that because the detail in the appendix, if it's really the minimum and something that is a hard recommendation, will include details that might be preempting other discussions. And so the idea that we have risk assessment and tools that identify a waiver of certain rules, non-lawyer ownership, fee sharing, to the extent we have other details that speak to things that haven't yet been addressed, I think that might be a point of objection if we float that in the context of risk assessment and proactive tools that has that level of detail, but some of those sort of internal key policy decisions haven't been made yet. So I think we would do it, we might sit on it, and then after those other discussions are had, then this detail won't trip it up. It'll be, okay, we did discuss that. We are going to waive 5.4. There will be non-lawyer ownership. So all of the detail about the risk assessment, assignment levels, when that is present for a provider, are all appropriate. So,
okay, so let me
I think that's the way to go.
Thanks, Randy. Let me suggest this. Let me suggest that we consider a motion for to adopt the language that's in front of us for the recommendation, subject to an appendix with additional levels of detail being developed before this recommendation is advanced to the working group, and so that it is advanced along with that appendix of the details that we're talking about. I'm just asking that because I think we'd like to at least put a pin in this part of the recommendation, even as we develop an appendix. Obviously, if we develop the appendix, it becomes clear there's something else or something more or something different that you know should be considered. We can always amend it, but I guess in the interest in having accomplished at least a step forward, I'd like to see if we could get approval of the recommendation as it's in front of us. Thoughts about that?
I think that sounds okay. I would take out this language that we just added about, that last, just the last one. Yeah, I would take that out since, that would be part of the resolution, that. But I guess from my perspective, I just, the preparation of this more detailed language, whether it's an appendix or whatever, that seems like a huge project. Maybe I'm wrong. Are we just pushing this too far down the road?
We can, I mean, Utah has a pretty good start. We have the paraprofessional working group that has given this a lot of thought already. And we do have some other models to look at. So, I mean, what we can do is the staff can mock up a starting point like we've been doing. And then, if we want to have like subcommittees, and people that we can work with on specific ones in the interim, just to kind of refine them and then present them back. I guess the biggest question is whether we should bring it back to this, the completed set to this group at the next SAGE meeting, and then bring the whole thing forward at the, I guess it would be January. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but like not the next working group, but the following working group.
Yeah, I guess my thought on that would be, we see just how difficult it is to put the appendices together, and timing wise. I mean, I think Leah makes an excellent point about just giving as much content there as we can within reason, considering the constraints that we're dealing with time wise and resource wise. But I agree with you, Bridget. I think we are reasonably close to the several page appendix that would spell out some of the specifics much more clearly than this does, or much more fulsomely.
Yes, I mean, the fact that things exist already make it's less daunting than just starting from scratch, I guess is the point. Right. So I do think it will take some time, but I don't think it will be months.
So in that case, I would support it coming back to our agenda for the December 15th meeting, and that gives us a nice time frame to shoot for too. Gives us about 4 weeks, maybe even more, to get the memo done and and circulated.
That sounds great. If that's doable. For me.
Did we get volunteers?
Not yet.
Okay.
Don't jump up at once.
Well, I think I obviously can help you, Bridget.
I'll volunteer.
Oh, good, Eric.
Thank you.
All right, so are we going to have a motion on this? Or are we going to table it?
What's the advantage of a motion? I'm happy to make it.
I don't know that there is. I mean, so that in our action summary from this meeting, it will reflect that we in fact, voted in favor of this recommendation, subject to the appendices being.
Motion to approve, subject to the modifications and whatever else John said.
And the appendices to be presented at the December 15 meeting.
That's it. You have your motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any more discussion about that? Okay, Mimi.
All right, Mary Baldwin,
Yes.
John Lund,
Yes,
Andrew Aruda.
you had to step out.
Okay, Judge Wendy Chang,
Yes.
Dan Dunfeld,
Yes.
Eric Helland,
Yes.
Wendy Mussel, Jim Sandman.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion carried.
Great. So does that finish that item, John?
Yes, I think it does. Thanks, everyone.
Great. All right. Now let's go to our item 2C, which is complaints, recommendations for complaints processing and compliance enforcement. So this is a new topic.
I'm sorry, Mary, I'm just going to interrupt real quick.
Sure.
But there's a second part of this memo about the risk criteria of the 2B. But I was just going to suggest that we just do the same thing, and I'll put together, sorry, before we get to 2C, the issue, if you remember, with the risk assessment that we presented to the whole group, but people were hesitant to vote on it because it had a model, it had a matrix as a model. And within the matrix, it assumed, certain service models would be accepted, and people didn't want to vote on it because we haven't decided what types of service models will be admitted into the sandbox. So in this memo, I attempted to kind of put at least the concepts together without actually acknowledging what the service model might be, or having an actual matrix. But I think, to Leah's point and what we just discussed already, it makes more sense to present this back to the group once and I really think this is something that scope is going to consider. Once we know, who can be in the sandbox, it will make more sense to bring it back to the full group when we have all of that information and can actually attach a matrix to it, as opposed to just continuing to talk about things in theory without the details. So I leave it to you. I just wanted to point out there is one more aspect of that item.
Eric?
I was just going to say basically the same thing, and this is not meant as a criticism. I think you did a great job having pulled out, but the problem is that was actually the criteria by which we were basing the risk assessment.
Yeah.
So, without knowing that, it almost reads like, firms that do risky things should be regulated because they are risky. So I would kind of second that I think, I understand people's concern, but that was the whole idea of how to assess the risk, was how far did you depart from the kind of existing model of the provision of legal services. And so once you pull that out, no offense, I'm not sure what it's saying.
Yeah, and I guess I think that's a fair point, Eric. And I'm okay with I'm okay with Bridget's thought that we develop this out in more detail before we really try to tackle it. I'm less clear that we table it until the scope committee makes some decision about. I mean, I don't know that it's going to make sense to just wait for that. What do you have in mind there?
So, John, here's the issue, just to throw this out, which is I actually think we had it right the first time. I understand people's concern, but the idea was that if we're taking as a starting point, and the point of the sandbox is to explore the risk of sort of movements away from the existing regulatory structure, then the farther you depart from that is the degree of risk. And if we're just saying, I think that principle made a lot of sense to me, right? It fit with what we're doing in the sandbox, and by truncating that, saying, well, we don't want to prejudge what's going to be let in. I understand the criticism, but then I don't know what the regulatory scheme, what's the criteria we're sort of looking at, right? I think Crispin put it well on like the very first day when we had the meeting, it's going to be very hard to do this assessment at the beginning, right? We're not, it's going to be very difficult from the filings. I mean, having read through the Utah filings, assessing the risk of an independent filing absent of some yardstick, I just think is really difficult. So I guess I just put the plug in for saying I kind of liked where we were.
And are you talking about the matrix that spells out the models?
Yeah, I mean, but the underlying principle, really, right? That it was that deviation from sort of the existing regulatory structure that determined kind of the level of risk along the lines of sort of lawyer involvement and so on, right? And so I think that was a pretty good way to come at this. It doesn't help us out of our dilemma. I'm just putting in the plug that I feel like. In fact, I even think the version you guys had before I messed it up and made a giant matrix out of it made a lot of sense.
I mean, are we really that far off on the potential models? I can't imagine that we're going to have a sandbox where there would not be, some potential for non-lawyer provision of legal services.
I agree.
With some level of lawyer oversight. I can't imagine we would end up with a recommendation where there was no model permitted where there was zero lawyer involvement. And that seems to be the one that was raising the biggest concerns. So I guess, Bridget, I'll throw this to you. Can we put the detail back in somehow and, kind of table that one item of a model that has no lawyers involved and see if we get any closer to the end, to the goal line?
Okay. Yeah, I can try. Yeah.
Was there other service models that people were?
I just think people were freaked in general by the concept. Like, we haven't talked about this. We haven't decided who's going to be in or out. We don't know what service models there are, and we don't want to vote to approve anything that might imply that we are approving this when we haven't decided whether we are approving this to come in. And so that's kind of at the crux of this whole thing. That's where I mean,
Well, do you understand that the scope committee is going to be making a decision, for example, a recommendation to the working group as to whether software with lawyer oversight or lawyer involvement would or would not be an allowed model in the sandbox? Do you think that that's the kind of thing they're deciding?
I do think so. I do think that they're going to be, that's some of the things that they're going to be talking about. I do. But I don't think it's like on their current agenda. So to your point, I mean, this might end up getting put off a little bit if we're waiting for that. On the other hand, consistent with our previous discussion, I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense to recommend things in concept without having that more concrete piece of it. And I really just don't know, actually. I mean, I don't mind trying to put something that's kind of in between together and see how that flies. I mean, we do want to have something to report back and discuss at the larger working group meeting in December, so I can.
Well, if it's all right with the committee or subcommittee, I guess I'd suggest that maybe Bridget and Eric and Mary and I put our heads together and try to figure out if there's some way forward in light of the goals that we've got here. And if we can get something put together for the 15th of December, the next meeting, great. But I'm not sure we're going to get to an answer on that right now, unless somebody else has an inspiration.
I don't have an inspiration, and let's talk about, I'm happy to work on that. I wonder if just simply saying, the limits of this are TBD, but we think the risk matrix is broadly correct is the way to go, right? To say you may just put a giant red line down, some of these ownership structures because they're not happening. But, where people would draw that line, I think varies by committee member.
Right. Well, and you could shade the bottom part of the matrix red and make a note to the side that nobody's agreeing that this type of model is even allowed, So I think there's some, anyway, that's what I'm thinking is we should kind of figure out if we can put that together in a way that will be coherent for our next meeting.
Okay, so as opposed to the full working group, I guess we'll just have to table this until the next.
Yeah, and then maybe they'll make some headway on the scope side in the meantime.
Okay, that sounds fine.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. I mean, I guess that does beg the question a little bit of what SAGE items we will be discussing at the next working group meeting. I don't think we really have anything on the table other than the item that we already started to discuss that we moved to the end of today's agenda. And I don't expect to have much progress on that in time for our next meeting. And then the item that we're about to discuss, which I guess maybe we could do something with this, is a little bit preliminary. In any event, let's just move into that discussion, which is the recommendations for complaints processing and compliance enforcement. So this is the other piece. So, proactive risk regulation is what we've been addressing. Now we also need to look at the piece of the regulation, which goes to, what happens when Sandbox participants do something wrong or bad or out of compliance, and how to think about the framework of compliance and enforcement tools that the regulator should use. And, there are lots of models for this. These are touched on in the memo and we're all familiar with them. I mean, for one major, big example would be the state bar's system of disciplinary enforcement, which of course is carried out through the Office of the Chief Trial Counsel and the internal state bar court, and then all of the associated apparatus, including investigators and all of that. We've got examples from the other jurisdictions who are, have implemented a Sandbox or Sandbox-like process. We've got the paraprofessionals working group Bridget included a link to their manual and specifically their discipline and enforcement section. And in thinking about all of this, you know, and again, this is the beginning, so we're not looking at coming up with a, you know, end point sufficiently detailed whole system here, but just kind of looking at the framework. One difference between the Sandbox context and some of, you know, like the other contexts I just mentioned, of course, goes to exactly what we've been talking about here today, which is the Sandbox regulator is going to be in, you know, very close touch, monitoring the performance of the Sandbox participants in a way that obviously, you know, the bar doesn't monitor lawyers. I don't think anyone's going to be monitoring paraprofessionals in that same, you know, very closely scrutinized way, including the reporting that we've been talking about and that we're going to further define and all of that. So it's a different context, and that might suggest a different sort of approach to compliance enforcement. And I just wanted to, you know, kind of highlight that before we move in. The memo, of course, lays out our identified risks, you know, that we've all agreed on, and then sets forth a kind of, we could call it a framework. This is over on page 2 of the memo, if you want to just advance it, Mimi. That the regulator, the memo suggests, there you go, that the regulator should establish thresholds to be utilized in enforcement, which correlate to, which basically set forth consequences to an individual provider or Sandbox participant according to the evidence of harm that that participant has caused. For example, as it's laid out here, a sort of escalating series of steps that would be taken depending on what the data or the evidence actually shows. So if you had a participant with modest evidence of consumer complaints, then they might be subject to increased monitoring and or specified remediation, say. When next step up might be substantial evidence of harm or a failure to remediate someone who's already gone through the first level, then the regulator might have the ability or be instructed, you know, to suspend the entity's ability to offer service, at least in that particular consumer area. Next step might be continued failure to remediate evidence of intentional bad acts, fraud, theft, etc., immediate termination of the entity's authorization, and then as another tool identified would be fines and sanctions, and there might be other steps, you know, in there that we would kind of define as we look at an enforcement framework. But that's something we need to discuss. I just want to kind of overview the points that we should try to discuss here at today's meeting. So that's one. And then we've got some specified additional questions for discussion, which include what other kind of, I don't want to call them tools since we're using that word a lot, but what other mechanisms could the regulator have in place to support its compliance and enforcement function? That's the item 2 here under additional questions for discussion, such as a client security funds or something like what the bar has to reimburse clients who are harmed by attorneys, or the mandatory fee arbitration program, a sort of volunteer program run by the regulator that offers a way for disputes between, in this case, attorneys and clients to be resolved. And then another question is, how might complaints be processed, prioritized, and handled? So those are the things that we need to discuss. I guess I would propose that we start with that kind of framework, the sort of escalating ladder of enforcement, which is on page 2 there. The regulator should establish thresholds. If you could go down there. I think we'll need to edit this memo to better call out that section.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Just noting this out loud for Bridget and John and I, to make it a little easier. But why don't we talk about what people think about, whether this is a useful way to articulate this, whether there are some additional levels that we can set forth, what do you think about this? Eric.
So just a question on, this seems kind of like a standard regulatory framework as I sort of understand it, right? You start with a letter that says, we've received a number of complaints, sort of you need to address them. And then there's a sort of a gradual escalation. I guess the part, and this may just be, are we envisioning something up to the end where, there's an actual, process for sort of assessing and appealing fines and things like that within the regulator? That doesn't seem unreasonable to me. I just haven't really thought about it until this moment that, or would that be handled under the court? It's an odd thing to have effectively an administrative court dealing with, sort of the provision of legal services. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Well, what you just described, an administrative court is exactly what we have with the state bar. But I don't think that we would contemplate setting up some kind of parallel structure to the, what I think, without knowing, is very expensive apparatus, that's in place at the bar. There would have to be some type of, there would have to be some type of structure within the regulator, to handle all of this. And that would include obviously monitoring the data and tracking the complaints, and, someone who there probably investigators need to be available. I noticed the paraprofessionals proposed to use the investigators at OCTC. But so investigators would have to be utilized, and then someone has to, be in a position to make these specific decisions around enforcement. And I would, I don't think that we've thought too specifically about how within the regulator that would be accomplished. Although just for my own purposes, I don't think I ever thought of it in terms of like a administrative court, like the state bar court. But you raise a good point about the appeals, which actually is something that I had thought about earlier and it didn't make it in here. But I think we will, as part of this, have to have some type of appeal process. It doesn't have, I was going to say it doesn't have to be, incredibly formal. I don't mean to prejudge where we might come out on this, but yes, there probably has to be some type of appeal process worked into here.
So follow-up question on that, because I could see the way I've been envisioning the sandbox, that the one penalty is you're out of the sandbox. You've lost your exemption, right? The appeal could go to the Supreme Court, right? We think the regulator sort of acted in error. The authority ultimately comes from the Supreme Court. It's the fines part that took me off in a different direction, right? Because it seems like now you really are in an administrative court territory where, someone would have to assess that. And I know that sounds a little toothless, that, the regulator sends strongly worded letters until it kicks you out of the sandbox, right? That doesn't seem to be enough, but it's just, as I've been sort of thinking about this framework, it seems like, that's what the regulator would have at their disposal, was these, basically giving people a temporary exemption or an exemption from, the sort of the practice of law rules. And once we throw fines in, we've given it a different power that it's going to need some way to deal with. And I'm just out of my depth. I don't even know what it is.
Okay, well, that's a really good point. The state bar doesn't really have fines and sanctions. I noticed the paraprofessionals have adopted or recommended some system of fines and sanctions, and maybe somebody who is more familiar with the paraprofessionals determination and discussion around that might be able to speak to this.
I have that up, the part up of their report that I was just looking at, and it has it says cite and fine, and then it says to be administered by OCTC, which is the Office of Chief Trial Counsel. If the fine and fee determination is disputed, that dispute will be adjudicated by a hearing panel. And they are recommending a 3-person hearing panel. The thing is that the paraprofessional is really just a very more of a traditional regulatory model of licensing, right? Compared to what we're recommending, you know, it's still more complaint based, I think. And we're talking about using the evidence, using the reports that we've been are getting to see if there are evidence of harm and then doing something about it proactively. But you're right. I mean, we do need to think. John, do you have fines in Utah? Is John, oh, there's John. Anyway, I'm not sure how they do it. I can't remember if I took the fine suggestion from Utah or from somewhere else. So I'm not sure how they administer it or if they've had to yet.
Justice Tucker?
I don't see the problem with fines, and it seems actually kind of appropriate if they're in the nature of user fees, really, because if someone gets a lot of complaints and it's going to require that those complaints be investigated and that the Sandbox regulator then explore whether some sort of sanctions are necessary, that's a lot of public entity expense. And so in requiring the regulated entity to pay some, you can call it fine, for the privilege of being investigated, doesn't strike me as changing the nature of what's going on. I kind of like this portion of the memo. I don't see a problem with it. I don't even know that we have to expressly include appeals, since I would assume, but someone can correct me on this, that the orders of the Sandbox, we're talking about orders of a Sandbox regulator imposing some sort of sanction on the regulated entity. And presumably, if the regulated entity doesn't like those orders, it could necessarily appeal them through the court system, administrative mandamus type applications, appeals, whatever you want to call them. It seems like further review is available through the court system without our expressly building it in. My strongest concern or suggestion, however you want to look at it, is that this component we've just been talking about is all about discipline within the Sandbox entity, and we have immediately following it discipline from the bar or whoever licenses the professionals. But I think non-disciplinary tools are really, really important. And if we're going to get to that next, I'll hold any further thoughts. But that's where I think there's a fair amount more work I'd like to see us discuss.
What do you mean by non-disciplinary tools?
So, for example, where you have under 2, later down on the page, you have client security fund and mandatory fee arbitration programs listed. I have some thoughts about those, but you could add to that an insurance requirement or bonding requirements. You could add the entire panoply of civil liability for bad outcomes, bad service, whatever you want to call it. So that would be liability in our civil court system, and that raises at least 2 issues I can think of. One is a question of whether it is desirable or even feasible in light of federal law to prevent that these things be resolved by matter of confidential arbitration, so that at least the Sandbox regulator has insight into who's being sued of the Sandbox entities and what evidence is coming out in those civil lawsuits, and what decisions are being made. So that's sort of one aspect, the waiver of arbitration, yes or no, or how does that work? And then the other question is the standard of care that would be imposed. Is it the standard of care that currently prevails for the provision of legal services of that type, which are presumably disaggregated? Or could it somehow be something different? And it seems to me like that package of issues is all important, and at least as important as the as the issues of what I'm calling discipline within the, by the sandbox regulator, akin to having your bar license suspended or revoked.
That's interesting. Yes, I know we've been talking about the standard of care, and then I think we've been talking about the insurance requirement, but I'm not quite sure. I feel like that's come up over in scope, maybe with the application. I'm not. It's not. I know I haven't been personally involved, so I know it hasn't been in this committee, that we've been talking about. I believe I hadn't thought about those, aspects of, I don't know what you'd call it. Since the regulator is not directly involved in carrying those out, I hadn't thought of that as part of this particular thing, but it is related to remedies available to a consumer. And so it is part of that broader set. So we can figure out how to refer to that here, even if we don't at this moment address those items. Anyone else want to address that point? Daniel?
Yeah, I was going to echo what the justice said. I was also unclear as to whether this was within our purview or within scope, but one way or another, it needs to be within one of ours. And from my perspective, it's something that needs to be looked at very carefully and brought to the entire committee for a vote. So agree with the justice, both in terms of not having any issues in terms of fines and similar measures on the one hand, and looking at things like bonding, insurance as sort of a precondition for play in the sandbox. And want some clarity as to who is going to take the laboring or in terms of looking at this and fleshing it out.
So on the insurance point, does anyone here in this meeting know to what extent scope is looking at that?
I don't think that scope is working on any of this basket of issues that we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And while I agree it's not the same thing as the regulator imposing discipline, it seems related to the regulator's ongoing supervision of performance of services in the sandbox. So I think it is a good thing to have in your bailiwick.
So on the insurance or bond requirements, well, I guess at this point we could figure out a way to structure the memo to add that. The standard of care, I've been giving that quite a bit of thought since we've been discussing it. Actually might do a memo on it to at least to start the discussion. So let's if people want to discuss those two issues now, happy to do it. Let's put it on the list and noted as we move forward. Good suggestions.
Mary, let me just jump in and say, I quickly called up the project plan report outline, and under the main heading for risk-based approach to regulation, which is assigned to SAGE and encompasses aspects of the charter 1/5 and 1/6, there is a bullet for how does this approach, namely risk-based approach, work, including the tools the sandbox should employ, audits, badges, complaints, data disclosures, secret shoppers, insurance or bonding requirements, etc. ? And so I only found insurance appear once in that project plan outline, and it was under the risk-based topic assigned to SAGE.
Well, perfect. There we go. Daniel, you have your hand up.
I'm sorry, once again, a vestige.
Okay. So, okay, well, we will definitely add insurance or bond requirements before, and I want to get people's input on, anything here that they want to give input on the insurance or bond requirements. I know, speaking from a position of not very detailed knowledge here, of course, we've had a lot of attention on the insurance side for lawyers. Is any of that useful or helpful as we try to determine what the requirements might be here? How do we figure out what are reasonable insurance or bond requirements in a sandbox context? John, do you guys have an insurance requirement in Utah?
We do not. I know there's been some discussion about the market, the availability of coverage for these type of services. And I remember hearing somewhere that there'd been some entity that maybe was, offering insurance. So that's encouraging. But I only make that point because I think we probably need to do some research around the practicality of imposing that type of requirement.
Justice Tucker?
I think it was our presenter from Arizona who mentioned insurance, and I kind of think she said they required it, but I agree with John that some further research in this area would be helpful. I suspect we might get some pushback on the subject of, well, lawyers don't have to have insurance, and if lawyers don't have to, why should other sandbox entrants have to? And that's where insurance may play in with some of the other points. For example, for lawyer wrongdoing, of course, first of all, lawyers have to take the bar and their bar cards are at issue. And so that's a difference between that and sandbox entrance. But also the client security fund and the mandatory fee arbitration program bullet points that are down here in the memo already. I think they're really interesting things to think about, but they don't seem to me like they translate very well into something that we would do in the sandbox. Because to stand up an entire mandatory fee arbitration program for our few entrants in the sandbox seems kind of ambitious. And similarly, a client security fund is great when you've got zillions of lawyers paying into it, but we're not going to have zillions of sandbox entrants paying into it. So obviously, to the extent we have lawyers in the sandbox, they would be covered through the client security fund when those lawyers do things bad. But in terms of having something separate for sandbox entrants, I have a hard time imagining that either of those two programs would translate and would cover sandbox entrants as such. And then the fact that they don't would be a really good argument for saying, and therefore you must have malpractice insurance and or bonding requirements that are pretty stiff because, yeah, we know we don't require that of lawyers, but for lawyers, we have this whole other regime that isn't available in the sandbox. Just a thought.
Yeah, that's a good point. Judge Chang?
What I was thinking is how most commercial liability policies, as I understand it, and I think this is worth looking at from an insurance perspective, aren't there professional services exclusions? So there would be no insurance available for this. I mean, I think that's a possibility. Because if we are allowing people into the sandbox and the thought that we're allowing them to practice law in that sense, I can see an insurance company saying, well, that becomes a professional service. And then a general liability policy will not cover that. And so I'm not sure, they probably need a new kind of policy.
Eric?
I think Judge Chang's right. Daniel, you may know sort of better than I, but I'm pretty sure that is an exemption. So that now, presumably some of these, LegalZoom and some of these others, Rocket Lawyer and others must have insurance. So if they've gotten a waiver or something in the commercial insurance market, it might be interesting to just ask some of these providers, or insurance companies, sort of how they're doing this, because that's my understanding as well. And yet I would be a little surprised if there wasn't some insurance behind some of these larger entities. So they must be doing something. I think the thing we might consider is that it may be a barrier to entry for firms offering services to people who don't currently have them. And so I flag that. I don't necessarily disagree with the insurance requirement, just that, the people who can get waivers may be larger, and whether or not, say, the University of Arizona entity could do that, that's a sort of a different story.
Dan?
This strikes me as an area where we all have pieces of information, but we need more than that. And there's also lots of expertise in the marketplace. So this strikes me as an area where either members of the committee in the first instance or members of the staff of the State Bar can get us educated, so we're all operating with a baseline of information that can educate our decisions. A lot of lawyers out there who do this for a living and would be able to educate us. And I know some of them, and I'm happy to be part of a group that would just take the lead in terms of getting this information to this committee and maybe down the line to the committee as a whole. So we have a little more in-depth information on this.
Well, I love a volunteer. So that's congratulations. You are head of the insurance task force inquiry.
Do I need insurance for this?
And anyone want to join Daniel in looking at the insurance question?
I just want to say, I don't want to join. Obviously, I'm not even part of the group, but there has been a lot of work done on these questions with respect to both attorneys and now paraprofessionals. So I'd want to make sure that you draw on the work that does exist. Now, this is both in relation to licensees or potential licensees at the State Bar, but lots of research has been done. And so I want to make sure that staff gets that to you so you're not sort of starting from scratch, including a lot of work on bonding, which of course is not required for attorneys. It will be required for paraprofessionals. And, there is some view that it is better than malpractice insurance, which only, malpractice insurance does not cover intentional bad acts, whereas bonds do. So
that's really helpful. Can the appropriate person just do a file? And just to keep it a good process. In addition to me, I think the co-chairs should also get it as just a matter of course, and we can take it from there.
Yeah, and we'll, Dan, just like we did with your first assignment that you helped us with, we're happy to, be involved and help, bounce ideas and help, figure out where to go with it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And one thought on insurance or bonding, and again, this is just so not my area, but I wonder if there could be different levels of insurance or bonding requirements based upon, the type of activity that the participant is engaged in or the type of service they provide, or maybe their risk level or something, because, some of the participants in the sandbox, may be providing the type of service that, really doesn't generate the possibility of significant loss to be experienced by clients, whereas others obviously do or might. So that's just something to think about too. But I am completely out of my depths professionally by suggesting that I really know nothing about insurance by design. So again, so luckily we have Daniel on the case. What do people have comments or input on other parts of this?
Can I say something about the fee arbitration program?
Mm-hmm.
And so early on, with regard to the structure of the sandbox regulator and the ability to carry out its activities operationally, there was the discussion about being able to contract with the State Bar or to basically to borrow from the State Bar certain resources. And so an example with regard to, say, the paraprofessional licensing program, it was suggested, and I think it's in the report, that the State Bar would allow paraprofessional licensees to access things such as the ethics hotline or to request ethics opinions on par with how lawyers have that, because we believe it's a good prevention tool. Since this is going to be run under the Supreme Court, I'm wondering if the organic law that creates the sandbox couldn't authorize the state bar to make available things to the sandbox regulator, such as telling admitted persons, you'll have access to the ethics hotline, you have access to the mandatory fee arbitration program. I think CSF is different. I think that's really just a euphemism for a restitutionary fund. And there's so many different requirements and bells and whistles, ornaments on that tree in the state bar that I think if there was a restitutionary fund, it should probably be exclusive to the sandbox activity. But in terms of things like mandatory fee arbitration, I would think there might be some sort of borrowing arrangement that might be accomplished so that we don't have to create our own construct for fee arbitration in the sandbox, given that it's a temporary construct anyway, the sandbox.
Yeah, that's a good possibility. I mean, now I do know quite a bit about the mandatory fee arbitration program, and my initial, and I'm the one who suggested that we include it on the list here. Not necessarily along the lines that you were suggesting, Randy. It's a good suggestion. But the concept of a dispute resolution program that is staffed by volunteers, just as a way to try to clear some. And I will say, of course, the bar's mandatory fee arbitration program is primarily administered through the local bars. And that could be quite a burden to impose, particularly if some of the fees at issue are quite minor. So anyway, there are a lot of issues we might want to think about, but it's a good one to consider. Andrew.
Just really quick, while we're on mandatory fee arbitration, as I'm sure you know, Mary, it's initiated under the statute. And so one possible approach could be to seek an amendment to the statute that sunsets X amount of years after, for however long the sandbox is established. And it's for disputes between attorneys and clients. And there's going to be a proposal to add paraprofessionals into the statutory language. And one option for the working group could simply be to add sandbox entities or participants and have that provision sunset as tied to the length of time the sandbox is operational. And then you would have all of the apparatus that everyone's talking about available to clients who utilize services through the sandbox.
Okay, thanks for that. Any other discussion of any of the other points here? What do people think about our little ladder of enforcement? Are there any? I mean, it's pretty abstract, necessarily, but is there anything obviously missing from it? Maybe can you page up a little bit? Yep, thanks. Right there, yep. I think I guess the other process, I think as a just general framework, it's probably successful. John?
I agree with that. I guess it may suffer from the same problem that our last conversation did, which is that, does it make a lot of sense to really advance this until we have it fleshed out? On the other hand, I don't know that we can write a whole criminal code sort of, process around this. And that I think would be pretty much from whole cloth. I'm not, unless the paraprofessional group has something along those lines, I'm not sure where we start on that. The other thing I'd note is, our data guy over in Utah can talk till your head spins about this, but there is a rate of consumer complaints, even for legal services, that one would consider tolerable and not, a reason for some sort of compliance or enforcement action. should there be a mechanism for them to resolve the complaint? Sure, but does it warrant, some sort of action against the provider? So I know you say modest evidence here, but I just wanted to make a note that there's some frequency of complaints that I don't know that would be expected to trigger some sort of compliance. At least that's how I would look at it.
Well, some complaints have merits and some don't. So, Justice Tucker?
So just thinking about the question of what might be added to this, a couple of things occur to me. It seems like on fines and sanctions, we might want to address what the maximums might be, or maybe more relevantly, what the measure might be. So for example, we might say assessed in a quantity that keeps in mind maybe the harm caused, the expensive, of the attention of the regulator, and the means of the provider to pay fines. We hardly want to bankrupt an entity that just made a small mistake, for example. But some further thought about saying what the fines and sanctions should be.
Can you say what that language was again?
Oh, I was just thinking that the severity of the harm caused, the ability of the sandbox entrant to pay a fine of any particular size, and the amount of regulatory effort that goes into investigating the complaints.
Yes, thank you.
3 things that I thought of. But the bigger point is just that if I look at where could we flesh out some of these things, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot more we can say about some of them, but fines and sanctions is one where I do think there's more we can say about them. And then one point, I don't know if it goes here or somewhere else, but I think consistent with the fact that we're in a different world in the sandbox from where we are with lawyers or paraprofessionals, that we might want to emphasize that it's complaints regardless of where they come from. Are these complaints made to the regulator? Those count and we look into them. Are those complaints made to the sandbox entrant? Those count and the sandbox entrant is responsible for keeping track of them and reporting them to the sandbox regulator. So it's both kinds of complaints that we're concerned about here. And that might be worth mentioning in some regard. And finally, and this is picking up on something that you said, Mary, we might want to address as part of this regime, recommending a mechanism for resolving complaints, or maybe this is a whole separate bullet item, mechanism for resolving complaints, but it seems like an area we might want to expand on. So I'm thinking of a couple of things here. I think in our list of tools, we might have talked about having an ombudsperson at the company who's responsible, at the sandbox entrant, who's responsible for responding to complaints. But I really liked your idea, Mary, of having as a feature of the sandbox, a forum where complaints can be mediated between the sandbox provider and the unhappy consumer by a volunteer. I don't see any reason to limit that to arbitration. It could also include quality of service, seems to me. And it seems to me that the sandbox type complaints might be sufficiently different from the sorts of complaints that would appear in a mandatory fee arbitration program, that it might be better to have a broader but sandbox specific, simple mediation of customer complaints type program, rather than try to incorporate and borrow the resource of the mandatory fee arbitration program.
Yeah, I like that idea. We're just about out of time. Thanks for filling this. This was kind of a nice, slightly more relaxed discussion. So we just had more time, which was great. Any other comments as we try to move this forward? So we didn't, we didn't have a resolution. I think that we can still take the comments made here, do a next draft of this and present it at our working group meeting, recognizing that we didn't specifically pass any kind of resolution around it. Do people agree with that? I can't see like any shaking heads or like big thumbs up or anything, but I'll take that as it. I'll take the silence as a yes, but that sounds good. Okay, any other comments?
I just wanted to say the one that we didn't get to was the item 2A that had to do with the framework, the regulatory, the issue about whether, all the rules would apply to members or to attorneys as if they were attorneys, except for if they're waived. And then we ran into this issue of how can things be waived? And the Office of General Counsel is putting this memo together that can, flesh out a little bit more the legislative oversight piece of it. So I think it makes sense to table that discussion until we have that framework in mind, and then we can revisit.
Okay, great. Well, that might help move us forward on that piece. So thank you. All right, anything else? All right,
Thank you,
thanks to
everybody.
everyone who volunteered for everything.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
see you soon. Bye.